Well, welcome to Fuquay-Varina United Methodist Church. We're so glad you're here for worship. If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Owen, one of the pastors here. We'd love to get to know you. And so if this is your first time with us or your first time in a long time, feel free to just text the word hello to the number that's right here at the bottom of your screen. We'd love to get back in touch with you today, see if we can answer any of your questions, help you engage your faith or the community around you. No matter how you found your way here with us today, we're so glad you did. But wherever you are, Facebook or YouTube, feel free to like or subscribe right there. We've got regular content that comes out on a pretty regular basis, and we would love for you to be able to see that. Also, if you see or hear anything today that you think is worthwhile, we'd love for you to share that with someone that you know, love, and trust. If you have any questions or want to follow up on anything that you stumble upon today, everything should be available right on our website, fvumc.org. You can navigate over there, and everything that we mentioned today should be easy to find on that website. While you're there, in the top right-hand corner, you will notice a little button that says Give, and we would love for you to support the mission and the ministry of our church that makes moments just like this possible, as well as helps us continue to serve in and around the greater Fuquay area as we serve out in our community, trying to make a difference. And so we're so thankful for your partnership, and really today we're thankful for your presence. We're glad you're here. We hope that you find something in these next few moments meaningful, and we pray that they will bless your life. Let's worship together.
Everybody has fears. Everybody got worries. Everybody knows sorrow, devastation. But we can lay our burdens down. Lay our burdens down. What a friend we have in Jesus. East to west, my sins are gone. I see grace on every horizon, and forever and ever His heart is my home. No more betrayal, for He is faithful. He fills me up and my cup runneth over. No more betrayal, for He is faithful. How He has proven it over and over. No more betrayal, for He is faithful. He fills me up and my cup runneth over. No more betrayal, for He is faithful. How He has proven it over and over, over and over. A friend we have in Jesus. East to west, my sins are gone. I see grace on every horizon, and forever and ever His heart is my home. What a friend we have in Jesus. East to west, my sins are gone. I see grace on every horizon, and forever and ever His heart is my home. Yeah, forever and ever His heart is my home.
Well, it's great to be with you guys, and I'm super excited, particularly today, to be with y'all because, today is kind of the launching off of our venue online, and just really excited for this project we've been working on, and really excited for how this worship and this community that we're working to build will continue to be beautiful and beneficial for you in your life. So glad you're here, and I'm glad to be able to be here with you. This week, we're turning to the book of Ruth, and as we are, it just so happens that last week I participated in a wedding. I had a chance to officiate a wedding, which is not an uncommon thing for me. I would say probably under normal circumstances, I do about a half a dozen weddings a year. I mean, who doesn't love a good wedding, right? Sometimes I do more, but generally, 6 or 8 over the course of a year. But it's been a year since I've done one, and so it was kind of interesting to get back in the saddle, if you would. Particularly interesting was coming kind of out of this wedding planning mode, preparing for this wedding, and reading the book of Ruth all at the same time. And really, I say that it's an interesting context to do both of those things at the same time for 2 primary reasons. The first of which is that a wedding is about covenant faithfulness, right? We're making a covenant with another person, promising to offer all that we have and all that we are, a mutual accountability, mutual trust, Again, loyalty and faithfulness over the course of time. And really, the book of Ruth is about the exact same thing. The Hebrew word that I kind of found myself attached to is the word hesed, H-E-S-E-D, if you want to go and search it up for yourself or try to learn some more about it. It's God's covenant faithfulness to us. Just to give you an example of where that shows up in Exodus chapter 20, and then again in Exodus chapter 34, when God has a chance to explain who God desires to be or who God is to God's people, twice in both places, God says this, I am the Lord your God. I am abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness to the 1,000th generation. Covenant faithfulness, it's love, loving kindness, but it's loving kindness over the course of time, right? It's loyalty and faithfulness. This is who God desires to be. I don't know that I've ever actually read Ruth after Judges. I normally kind of read it on its own right. But really, I think that Ruth is not just a reprieve from the violence in Judges or Joshua or Deuteronomy before that, but that Ruth in a lot of ways is the response to Judges. What we see in Judges is, we talked about it last week, this sort of trajectory, this tragic trajectory that just winds up in a place of unfaithfulness. In fact, the end of Judges begins much the same way that Judges begins. It says this, there was no king in Israel. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and all the people did what was right in their own eyes. Again, the book of Judges ends in this place, which in my mind is the opposite of Hesed. It's people doing what they want to do on their own, not a covenant faithfulness and a loving kindness between God and God's people. The story of Ruth is a fantastic and a beautiful answer to that last verse. The first verse of Ruth, the next verse you read, begins, it says, in the days when the judges ruled. So Judges is the context. Judges is the setting. And I think when we come out of Judges, there's this anxiety about whether or not God's Hesed would carry through, whether God would continue to be faithful to us, given how far from our faithfulness to God that we've fallen. There's a sense of like almost chronic dread about whether God will be faithful to us. The first chapter of Ruth 10 times uses the word shuv, which means to turn or to return. It's the same word that we use for repent. It's almost like when we get to Ruth, we're hitting a turning point. And then we hear 3 really important moments when that same word hesed, this nature and character of God, gets mentioned. The first time is we see Naomi is going to proclaim faith in God's faithfulness. Second, we see God's providence as hesed towards Ruth. And then finally, Boaz names that Ruth is one who does hesed, one who does this kind of faithfulness. We see in Ruth God's answer to this deep anxiety about whether or not God will remain faithful to us. Ruth's story reminds us loudly that even when nothing seems to be working, God is at work. Even when nothing seems to be working, everything seems to be unwinding itself, God is at work. The second reason that I say this is a perfect book to read at the same time I'm planning a wedding is because there is a regular wedding passage that shows up in Ruth. Maybe you've heard it before and you didn't know necessarily where it came from, but Ruth says this, where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God, my God. It's a beautiful marriage passage. However, I'll tell the story of Ruth in just a second, but sometimes I like to remind people who are choosing that passage for their wedding that this is actually a passage that a daughter-in-law says to a mother-in-law, kind of professing her loyalty after all of their husbands have died, which sometimes makes it feel maybe good for marriage, but maybe not as great for a wedding. Let me tell you the story of Ruth real fast, and I'm going to try not to get way into the weeds of things, but I'd love for you to go and read the story for yourself as you have time over the course of this week. So here's the story poorly retold. First, a mom named Naomi goes with her husband and her two sons, and they flee their hometown of Bethlehem, and they go kind of behind enemy lines to enemy territory into Moab. And they do that because they're fleeing a famine that exists in the land that God has given to the Israelites, suggested, of course, because of their collective unfaithfulness, set up by that first verse in the days of the judges. I think that this is a kind of a way of saying desperate times call for desperate measures. There's not a real clear sense in the story that there's any judgment towards them for doing this, but what we see pretty quickly is that Naomi's family does all the things that God has been trying to prevent since back in Exodus. That is, that God doesn't want God's people intermingling with folks that live by a way that's not consistent with the nature and character of God, and that God doesn't want them to intermarry. And here we see that exact same sort of thing happen. So not only are they living in Moab, but Naomi's two sons married two Moabite women. After they do, all of the husbands die. Good story for the dudes. All the husbands die, and now we have Naomi, who is stuck there in this foreign place, in this foreign country, with these two daughters-in-law. And, that's, at that time, like societally speaking, that's like the worst news to the power of three. I mean, as a widow, you have no power. Now we have three widows trying to work together to figure it all out. And so this like Harry and the Hendersons sort of moment, if you know that movie, Naomi insists that her daughters go back to their husbands' families and go back to their dad's families and try to find, some comfort, try to find a place where they can survive and protect themselves. And she's going to go back to her hometown of Bethlehem. One says yes and goes back. The other, Ruth, sticks with her and says these words, "Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God." And so they leave and they head back to Bethlehem. Now, in that moment, we see the Hesed, the acting out of Hesed with Ruth as she proclaims this covenant faithfulness to her mother-in-law. So there's like this glimmer of hope that exists. But really here, the story is just sort of starting to bottom out. In fact, Naomi says it this way, as soon as they get back to Bethlehem. She said, "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." In fact, at that point in time, she changes her name from Naomi, which means pleasant, to Mara, which means bitter. The same is also true for Ruth. Ruth is now a foreigner in a strange land. In fact, they refer to her as the Moabite or the Moabite woman. I mean, it's clear that that's a part of her identity as the stranger and foreigner and outsider, and already a widow. All these things just seem to be stacking up against the two of them. And the two of them get together and they cook up this plan to find some food. And one of the regulations of faithful farmers in Israel was that they would leave the edges of their field unharvested so that those who had no food could come by and find food. And so we basically see, as the story continues, Ruth begins to scavenge for food just to help them survive. And while she's doing that, she meets the owner of the field, whose name is Boaz. So here's like the third main character in the story. And he's really impressed by the faithfulness of Ruth, and he sort of names that that's a thing, right? We just mentioned that a second ago. And through some twists and turns, we see that Ruth, this person of great faithfulness and loyalty to her mother-in-law, meets Boaz, who is also a person identified in his community as a person of great faith and loyalty, of Hesed himself. Through twists and turns, they end up getting married. And the title for Boaz, as this is all taking place, is that Boaz is their kinsman redeemer. So again, the idea, societally speaking, is that a kinsman redeemer could, in a sense, be the antidote to widowhood, right? So Boaz, in a sense, grafts these two women onto his part of the family tree. That he adopts them into his family, and that he redeems their station and their status in life. And at the very end of the book, we see that Naomi gets her name back. Pleasant is returned to her, as is her lineage, as Ruth and Boaz conceive a child. Now, in this restoration, I think we see not just the restoration of two people at one point in time, but I think that this story, while it may be about two people or three people, if you count Boaz as a part of that, it has real like cosmic implications, right? It's out of this unexpected faithfulness between these parties, these three parties, that a son is born. And that son's name is Obed. And Obed later has a son whose name is Jesse. And Jesse later has a son whose name is David, King David. And it's through David's lineage that we come to read about great David's greater son, Jesus of Nazareth. So here we see in this redemptive sort of moment and Ruth's story, a reflection of our very own story. In Ruth's redemption, we get our own redemption. I mean, just think about that for a second, just how powerful that is. Here, prominently placed in the lineage of Jesus, the Savior of the world, we have a woman named Ruth who was an outsider and a widow, did not belong, did not have any access to any sort of power and had to scavenge for food. And she becomes a central player, a central actor in helping the whole entire redemption of the world come to be through her covenant faithfulness and the covenant faithfulness of Boaz in return to her, who grafted her in to his family tree, who adopted her into his family and gave her a new way of life. The child that Boaz and Ruth give birth to gave birth to the child who would one day do those very things for us. And particularly on a day like today on Pentecost, we can celebrate that it's through Jesus Christ that we ourselves have been grafted into a family tree, adopted into an inheritance that is larger than we could ever imagine, the grace and the mercy of God, and that we are given new life through this redemptive act. Her story and our story are reflections of each other. But there at the very bottom of her story, right? So let's go back like 60 or so chapters before we get to Ruth. You just see this long, slow, spiraling downward trajectory to this bottoming out sort of moment in the story of Ruth. And in the story of Ruth, we see this whole trajectory begin to turn itself around. Now, for the last 60 chapters, as things have been getting worse and worse and worse, while nothing was working, God has been at work. Here's the thing that I don't understand. What made Ruth and Naomi and Boaz so different from everybody else that we've been reading? Leaders for the last 60 chapters have been trying to turn this thing around. They've all been trying to be the catalyst that calls the people of God back to faithfulness. But it seems as though at the very end of everything, as we look back on this long, slow progression downward, the narrative arc from Joshua all the way through Ruth's story, we discover that leaders don't provide the turning, but God does. It's God's faithfulness that's always going to catch us at the bottom of our stories. Now, why that's a challenge for me is because I think what this means is that we are called to reflect the faithfulness, the nature and character of God, even when things don't seem to be working in our lives. We're called to imitate the hesed of God, the way of God, even in the bottoms of our stories. Not because we are faithful or we can prove our faithfulness back to God, but because living like that, even when nothing is working, is an indication that we have faith in God's faithfulness. Now, most of the time, if I'm real honest, when nothing seems to be working, I work harder. Because at the end of the day, I feel like it's my responsibility to turn it around. If it is to be, it's up to me. That's my mentality. I don't know that that's exactly what Ruth is inviting me to consider. If anything, I think with the story of Ruth, this bend in the road, this turning point in the narrative of God that points us towards restoration, towards connecting with the family of God, towards being included even when we found ourselves as strangers and aliens to the commonwealth of Israel, having no hope in the world and without God, that God has chosen to adopt us, to graft us. If I'm going to have faith in all of those things, I have to have faith that even in the bottoms of my stories, that God's faithfulness is at work. It's not my faithfulness that's going to turn the story around. It's God's faithfulness to me. And so, my prayer has to be daily, even when nothing seems to be working, oh Lord, I know you are at work. I wonder what of these words today challenged you, and I wonder what of these words gave you a new sort of hope. May that be your prayer this week.
Good morning. We invite you to stand and sing with us in worship.
In the dark and all alone, growing comfortable. Are you too scared to move and walk out of this tomb? Buried underneath the lies that you believe, safe and sound, stuck in the ground, too lost to be found. You're just asleep, and it's time to leave. Come on and rise up, take a breath, you're alive now. Can't you hear the voice of Jesus calling us out from the grave like Lazarus? You're brand new, the power of death couldn't hold you. Can't you hear the voice of Jesus calling us out from the grave like Lazarus? Rise up, rise up, out from the grave like Lazarus. When he said your name, the thing that filled your veins was more than blood, it's a kind of love that washes sin away. Now the door is open wide, and the stone's been rolled aside. The old is gone, the light has come, so come on and rise up. Take a breath, you're alive now. Can't you hear the voice of Jesus calling us out from the grave like Lazarus? You're brand new, the power of death couldn't hold you. Can't you hear the voice of Jesus calling us out from the grave like Lazarus? Rise up, rise up, out from the grave like Lazarus.
Calling us to walk out of the dark, and he's given us new resurrected hearts. Oh,
He's calling us to walk out of the dark. He's given us new resurrected hearts. Oh, come on and rise up, take a breath, you're alive now. Can't you hear the voice of Jesus calling us out from the grave like Lazarus? You're brand new, the power of death couldn't hold you. Can't you hear the voice of Jesus calling us out from the grave like Lazarus? Rise up, rise up, out from the grave like Lazarus. Rise up, rise up, out from the grave like Lazarus.
Well, again, it's been great to be with you for worship here at Fuquay-Varina United Methodist Church. We're so glad that you chose to worship with us in this moment. If you heard something meaningful today that you think would benefit someone else, feel free to share it with them. If there's something that we can follow up on that would be helpful for you, you can just text the word hello to the number that's right here at the bottom of your screen. We'd love to get back in touch with you today, see how we can answer your questions, help you engage your faith and the community around you. Again, we're here all the time, so don't hesitate to reach out if there's something we can do. Anything you've heard us say or mention today can be found on our website, fvumc.org, so you can navigate over that way on the interwebs and go find what you're looking for there. But if there's any way that we can be a resource for you or an assistance as you journey through your life of faith together, please don't hesitate to reach out. It's been great to be together, and we'll see you next time.